مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. نحن في منتصف فصل الصيف حين يبدأ الحر الشديد في واشنطن يماثل شبه الجزيرة العربية، ويبدأ كثير من الناس في الإيمان بالظاهرة الاقتباس الحراري. غادر الرئيس والكونغرس ومعظم واشنطن البلدة في طريقهم إلى الشاطئ، الجبال أو أي مكان. لم تختفي مشكلات دولتنا، وإنما اختفى فقط الأشخاص المنتخبين لحلها. إذن هذه الفرصة مثالية للنعود فنلقي نظرة على الضيوف الرائعين الذين تشرفنا بصحبتهم في برنامج داخل واشنطن على مدار العام الفائت. داموا جمهوريين وديمقراطيين، صحفيين وسفراء، مسؤولين حاليين وسابقين من مختلف الفروع التنفيذية والتشريعية للحكومة. وفيما يلي بعض من أهم ما جاء على ألسنتهم.
Can you describe for our viewers a little bit about the district from which you come? I asked this of all congressmen that I interviewed because it is fascinating for our viewers to understand the home area that produces congressmen.
Well, we have about 750,000 people who live in the district, and it's a wonderful, different, distinctive group of people. I have the banking financial system, one of the largest financial systems in the country.
This is in Charlotte, North Carolina.
In Charlotte, North Carolina. We have the home of Bank of America. We have a major presence of Wells Fargo Bank, both international banks. And we have other ancillary financial businesses related to those institutions. And so probably 3,000 different businesses that relate some way or another to financial services. That's why I'm on the Financial Services Committee, to represent that real need and interest that we have. Then on the other side, we are the home of NASCAR.
You have to explain for our viewers what NASCAR is.
Well, NASCAR is racing, and it's
automobile racing.
Automobile racing, it sure is. And so it is probably the biggest viewing sport in the country, and it started, many, many decades ago in the North Carolina hills, bootlegging. These were people who went out there creating their own gin and alcohol, and they would race it back and forth between areas and destinations and try to outrun the police, so the highway patrol. But NASCAR kind of was born through that. But it is a huge industry for North Carolina. It's about a $6 billion industry. I have 14 NASCAR teams that are in my district.
So between car racing, bootlegging, and banking.
Well, we don't do any bootlegging anymore.
Even the president's strongest partisans, nobody will suggest that this has been a banner moment for American foreign policy. What are the implications of that for all those other items that you spoke about earlier, the rest of the president's agenda?
Well, it's one, for sure it's delayed it all. Secondly, it was going to be terribly difficult to get anything done anyway, almost impossible to get anything anyway, and his polls are now down to 43%, about as low as they've been for years, and that does not help him. I mean, so his enemies look at this and say, wait, this guy's on the run, and they're emboldened. So, I think the bottom line here is we could have a catastrophe, an economic catastrophe, quite shortly, because his enemies are refusing. They've targeted his signature initiative, the Obamacare healthcare reform, and they've decided that they're willing to shut down the government or have the United States default on its national debt. This is a large clutch of House Republicans, and they're emboldened by all this. They think that he's a weak leader, and that they have him on the run, and they're going to do what they want to do anyway. But they feel stronger.
That would have happened even without Syria. The fact is the weaker leaders are the Republican leaders in Congress who don't have control over their own troops. There's a kind of civil war going on within the Republican Party. And John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, tried to bring up a proposal that would have at least postponed the notion of a government shutdown. He had to pull it from the floor because he lost 45 or more of his own members who are being goaded on by Ted Cruz and conservative Republicans in the Senate, undermining their own leaders. Now, I do think the worst of all possible worlds for Obama would have been to have the Syria issue come to a vote in Congress, and it would have lost in the Senate, and it never would have gotten to a vote in the House. Senate was not going to vote for something that was going to go down in the House. Then it would have given an even stronger hand to the most arch conservatives who don't care about shutting down the government or breaching the debt limit. So he's avoided that. But the fact is, if none of this had happened with Syria, we would still be heading towards a potential serious catastrophe on the economic front. And there, I think Obama is going to hold firm, and his position is going to be, I'm not going to negotiate with terrorists over America's full faith and credit. And if it takes lancing a boil in this case to deal with this set of issues, that's what we're going to have. And I do not think that he will cave. And if he did, he would lose his own Democratic Party almost entirely, which would leave him with nobody.
What would you say, if you had to think out 10 years, would be the greatest potential flashpoints of possible conflict between the United States and China?
That one's easy right now because Japan and China have very complicated relations right now, including territorial dispute over a couple of rocks in the ocean between China and Japan. And for historical reasons, they're included under the U.S. security umbrella. So, come back to U.S., how Chinese people feel about the U.S. I've emphasized a lot of positive things, but you'll also have cab drivers ask you, why is the United States protecting Japan's claim to what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands? So if there were a miscalculation, I think it would be over that territorial issue, and because the United States has put Japan under a security umbrella, that would be the main risk of some kind of conflict between the U.S.
We did have in recent weeks an unusual, perhaps fleeting blip of bipartisanship. There was an agreement on the budget to extend throughout the next year. And then we just had an agreement on a long overdue agriculture bill, a farm bill. Are we seeing the light at the end of the partisan tunnel in Washington, or is this really just a blink of an eye?
Sorry, blink of an eye. And I think the next thing to come along is the debt limit. If we don't raise the debt limit once again, the United States will default. And there's now much back and forth about, will it be conditioned and will it actually pass? I think the Republicans have learned that playing with catastrophe is very bad politics for them. And somehow they will manage to fashion the votes to get past the debt limit with minimum strings attached, just in order to keep the issue on Obamacare. They think that is such a winning issue for them that they don't want anything else to disturb the environment, including, for example, immigration reform. I mean, there was a smallest chance that this bipartisanship could extend to an immigration reform, which we desperately need, and which would actually improve economic growth if you allowed in people, entrepreneurs and so on, more of them into the country. Can't get an agreement on it. The Republicans are divided on it, so they've just pushed it off the table.
It's not going to result in suddenly a thaw out there. For a variety of reasons. There just isn't much that Republicans want to do in Congress right now. They can't find a consensus around much of anything. It was very interesting. If you look back over the last couple of years, Speaker John Boehner has been a non-player in most of the major things. He's stepped aside from it. He's tried to avoid catastrophe, but that's been pretty much it. The Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, has stepped in at the last minute frequently to make deals. Now the roles have been reversed. Boehner is leading and trying to get an immigration bill done, and when he made some signals that he was going to move forward quite assertively, Mitch McConnell threw a bunch of cold water on it and said, well, there's just, the gap is too big. He has a re-election battle and is fighting,
he being Mitch McConnell, the senator,
and has a serious problem on the right, but now we have a survey showing that in fall campaign he's down several points to his Democratic challenger. That makes the ability to cut deals just much more difficult right now. And what we can hope is that we'll avoid some of this brinksmanship and moving right to the edge of catastrophe. That'll be about it. And what's also interesting is that the Republicans' hopes in 2014, as Mort said, are built on Obamacare collapsing. If it doesn't collapse, there's no plan B there. And it'll be interesting to see what happens if we reach the late summer or early fall and the 80% of Americans who are not directly affected by Obamacare, it's just not on their radar screen. And the other 20% are split probably fairly evenly among those who think it's terrible and those who get some benefit out of it.
We haven't really mentioned much the notion that another government shutdown still does hang over the heads of everybody here in Washington. What are the chances that that we begin 2014 and pretty soon we see government shutdown again? What do you think, Alan?
Well, you know, never underestimate the ability of the Republicans to pull defeat out from the jaws of victory. You know, right now, Obama's looking bad, the Democrats are hurting, but if the Republicans precipitate another shutdown of government, that's going to become the new story. As in the past, they're going to get blamed for it, and the whole storyline in Washington changes. You know, journalism, it's a pack, and it turns as a pack. So unless the Republicans are incredibly stupid, that's not going to happen, but I wouldn't put it past them.
You know, ironically, the chances of a shutdown or a default are much less because of the debacle with Obamacare. Republicans realized that that was a disaster for them when they shut down the government. Now the focus is turned almost entirely to the problems with the rollout of the health care plan. They want to keep the focus there. Their leaders do not want another shutdown. But what we're seeing is with these negotiations over the budget, and the deadline is December 13th, they're probably not going to meet that deadline. There's still these stark differences between the parties on what our priorities ought to be in spending, and Republicans refuse to consider revenues as a trade-off for making some additional spending cuts. So I don't think we'll see a shutdown now. We'll probably see the ball moved further down into the early part of next year. But we're going to have more confrontations over these fundamental issues of spending and taxing before we're done. And the inability of Republicans to move away from their no taxes pledge makes it almost impossible to imagine a larger bargain. It's now becoming more difficult even to find a smaller bargain.
And Obama's going to say, throw me into that briar patch. I'd much rather have this debate on fiscal policy, on the role of the government with the Republicans, than everybody talking about a website that doesn't work, insurers that aren't cooperating, people that can't sign up. And remember, things turn quickly. Poll numbers can move up and down very rapidly, so we shouldn't dwell too much in the moment.
Where's the red line, to use the term, at which the United States does use military force?
You know, again, I think one of the interesting ways to think about this issue is you don't necessarily have to use military force against in the context of Ukraine. A readiness to use it elsewhere sends a message to the Russians as well. I mean, this is an interconnected world. Wherever we act in a way where we actually use hard power, it's going to be noticed by him, by Putin. So, I mean, if we made it clear we were ready to, we really do have a threshold with Iran where we're prepared to use force, he would understand that has consequences for him as well. One last point. One way to signal him, even in the current context, would be to provide much more military assistance to all the frontline states that are facing Russia today. You know, we should be doing more in the Baltic states right now. We should be doing more in terms of exercises, and we should be getting real military material to Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be clarity with our NATO partners. That's incredibly important, not just for NATO, but also our friends and allies around the world that depend on the security assurances of the United States. So that has to be a pure red line without equivocation, that if anything is done to undermine a NATO country, that would be an attack against the U.S. And I agree with Dennis. You can put at risk other things that the Russians care about. They have a base in Syria. Perhaps a Syria policy reshift puts that at risk as well.
And you are convinced that in today's environment, don't hit Syria, don't give pass the aid program to Ukraine, that Congress would support the NATO commitment, Baltic states, Poland, et cetera, that the American people would support doing what needs to be done.
You know, I think that this may be one of those moments where the public begins to react as well. It's one thing to look at the Middle East where you see conflicts where we've invested so much and the public says, what did we get for it? It's something else to look at a different part of the world which plays on more traditional kinds of instincts that the public may have and say, if we sit back and we do nothing, how confident can you be that we're not going to face much more immediate threats someplace else?
If the American people in Congress aren't willing to support our NATO allies, we've got a bigger problem on our hands. We've got to reassess the security assurances we've given around the world. And that goes not just for our NATO partners, but for countries like Taiwan, Israel, the Gulf states. This may be a moment of reflection for the American public, but I would assume that Congress and the American people would be behind supporting our NATO allies.
Now, we've done this whole discussion without mentioning personalities in any way, but personalities are important. First, who abroad in your readership are fascinating to your readers? Who Americans? And who do you think is important to project to your readers as one or two people that they really should know more about?
Well, clearly the number one sort of figure who fascinates foreigners is Barack Obama. I think that people are working out now that he is not what they imagined. So in Europe, I remember being in Europe when Barack Obama won his first election in 2008, and Europeans lazily assumed that because they hated George Bush and because Barack Obama was against George Bush, then they were automatically Barack Obama's best friend, and that he was somehow European and might sort of agree with them on all of their criticisms of America. And I think that some of the sort of disappointment that you can see in not just in Europe, but maybe in the Middle East over the last few years has been a realization that Barack Obama is an American president, and his primary concern is American voters and getting America right. And he is not some global kind of celebrity who is equally interested in every country. Who should they know more about? They should clearly know more about members of Congress. There are key figures, and they should understand them as politicians and where they come from. People like Ted Cruz, Texan senator, who we're going to hear more from, very effective populist. People like John Boehner, incredibly important man here in Washington, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the most important Republican. I would say most foreign readers don't really know who he is. They're learning now.
Are there any major issues where today American and Russian interests are aligned?
Well, I do think Iran is one where they may not be in perfect alignment, but they remain generally converging. The Russians are not interested in Iran having a nuclear weapons capability. That doesn't serve them. It's not in their interest. So that is basically an area where there's a convergence. Now, I say not completely aligned because I think the Russian attitude towards what they can live with is dramatically different from what we think we can live with. And I think the Iranians will at some point now test again the possibilities. During Ahmadinejad's time, he never gave the Russians an opening. And in a sense, now you have a leadership, certainly with Rouhani, who's quite prepared, I think, to play upon what may be the fissures. And if there's a dissidence in terms of what we and the Russians can accept in terms of a comprehensive agreement outcome, you can see, I think we will see them try to exploit it. But that hasn't happened yet. So far, there's been a kind of coherence to what we're doing in the negotiations with the Russians, so this is one to watch.
Dennis said a moment ago that essentially Putin is playing a weak hand very well. How does the United States respond to that? What's the most effective way to exploit that?
Well, I think there's a real politique dimension to the relationship between the U.S. and Russia and the reaction to it, because in some ways you do need Russia. You need them to play a constructive role in Syria. You need them or want them to play a constructive role with Iran and in North Korea, even in Afghanistan post-2014. And there are areas of cooperation like counterterrorism, which in some ways complicates the Syria debate. But at the end of the day, Russia has a role to play in the world. You can't ignore them. But I think, we have ceded too much of the diplomatic table setting to the Russians. And I think trying to take some of that back, take some of the spotlight from Putin, from Moscow, not relying wholly on the conferences that are co-sponsored by the Russians, not always sort of following and flowing to Moscow for the first solution or the first offer, is probably a good diplomatic step here to take the sting out of the Russian approach.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الأفكار التي سمعتموها لحل مشكلات واشنطن، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.